December 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Ground south of Berlin. The winter air bit through the coats of the men gathered around the steel giant Tiger I tank, its armor plates glistening with frost. Beside it stood a small group of German scientists and officers from the Waffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office. They were used to Thunder 88mm guns, roaring engines, and the smell of cordite. But today, in the snow, lay something almost laughable. A thin metal tube, barely shoulder-length, painted olive green with a crude trigger and wires. Captured from American troops in North Africa, they said. A rocket weapon for infantry, the bazooka. One officer chuckled. Amerikanische Spielerei, American tinkering. A toy the command was given. The weapon hissed. A faint plume of smoke trailed across the frozen air. Then a flash, a thud, and a dull roar. The Tiger's armor, 80mm thick, now bore a hole the size of a man's fist. The laughter stopped. Only silence remained, and the slow rising awareness that something fundamental had just changed in the art of war. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the tank was king. Across Europe, its steel treads and thundering guns symbolized unstoppable momentum. The German Blitzkrieg lightning war had rewritten military doctrine. Tanks no longer advanced cautiously. They led the assault, slicing through enemy lines with speed and shock. Infantry, once the mainstay of the battlefield, suddenly found itself outmatched. Bullets bounced off armor. Grenades could only dent tracks or scratch paint. A soldier's rifle, even the finest Mauser or Springfield, was useless against the iron beasts rolling across Europe. By 1940, the British and French armies had learned this the hard way. Panzer divisions carved through France with ruthless precision. The Allies scrambled to find an answer. A weapon light enough for a single man to carry, yet powerful enough to pierce armor. They experimented with magnetic mines, anti-tank rifles, and cumbersome guns hauled by mules. None were practical. The Soviets produced heavy rifles like the PTRD, capable of puncturing light tanks but failing miserably against newer armor. The Germans fielded their 3.7cm Pak 36, a gun soon nicknamed the Door Knocker, because its shells simply bounced off British Matildas. The race for a portable anti-tank solution was on. In America, a quiet revolution was taking shape inside the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, an obscure Army officer, Colonel Leslie Skinner, was experimenting with shaped charges, a concept first discovered during the 1880s but only recently understood. The idea was elegant: concentrate explosive energy into a single point. When a cone-shaped charge detonated, it focused its blast into a narrow jet capable of melting through armor like a torch through butter. It didn't rely on brute force, it relied on physics. By 1942, American scientists had successfully miniaturized this principle into a small, fin-stabilized rocket. But there was one challenge: how to deliver it accurately from a safe distance. Lieutenant Edward Uhl, a young engineer, later recalled, "We had the rocket, we had the warhead, but nothing to launch it with." One day, Uhl improvised. He slid the 2.36-inch rocket into a scrap metal tube, attached a simple trigger, and wired a battery to fire it electrically. It was crude, untested, but it worked. The contraption was nicknamed the Bazooka, after a whimsical musical instrument played by comedian Bob Burns. The name stuck. Partly in jest, but within months it would be spoken with awe across the front lines. The first bazookas arrived in North Africa in 1942, carried by U.S. infantry during Operation Torch. At first, the weapon drew skepticism. Its range was short, its rocket slow, and it produced a telltale trail of smoke. But when American troops used it against German Panzer IIIs and IVs, the results were startling. Where rifle rounds failed, the shaped charge punched clean holes through steel. A single man could now disable a tank worth thousands of dollars, and with it, the balance of battlefield power began to shift. Reports quickly reached Berlin. Field units described a small rocket weapon capable of piercing armor of medium thickness. The German High Command dismissed early claims as exaggerations. After all, no handheld weapon could destroy a panzer, but that belief would soon change. In early 1943, amid the retreat from Tunisia, the Afrika Korps captured several intact bazookas left behind by American forces. They were boxed, labeled, and sent back to Germany for analysis of their destination. Kummersdorf, the heart of German weapons research, the device that had seemed absurd, now sat under the scrutiny of scientists and engineers who believed they understood everything about explosive power. They would soon discover that simplicity could be more terrifying than complexity. By mid-1943, Germany's once unstoppable war machine was beginning to show cracks. The Afrika Korps had been driven from North Africa. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in catastrophe. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet T-34s rolled forward in staggering numbers. The Luftwaffe was losing air dominance. Allied bombers pounded the Reich day and night. Within the corridors of the Waffenamt, the German Army Ordnance Office, a grim urgency began to grow. They needed weapons that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and used by the average soldier. Tanks were costly. Artillery required fuel and transport. But infantry, armed with something powerful and portable, could still hold ground. So when a strange American rocket weapon arrived from Tunisia, it caught their attention not because it seemed impressive, but because it was different. At first glance, the bazooka looked amateurish, a thin-walled launch tube open at both ends. Simple batteries, wires, and a crude trigger grip. No optical sights, no precision parts. For German engineers accustomed to finely crafted machinery weapons built with millimeter perfection, this looked like a child's toy. But when they disassembled it, curiosity turned to respect. Inside the warhead was a perfectly engineered copper cone, shaped to focus explosive energy into a concentrated jet. The concept was known in Germany as the Hohlladung, or hollow charge. But the Americans had done something the Germans hadn't yet achieved at scale, made it light, stable, and man-portable. Dr. Erich Schumann, head of the German Army's Weapons Research Institute, was among those who examined the design. His notes, preserved after the war, described the weapon as technically unsophisticated, yet ingeniously effective. In short, it worked because it didn't try to be clever. By autumn 1943, several prototypes had been reverse-engineered in German workshops. They were tested first on mock armor plates, then inevitably on real tanks. Reports from Kummersdorf soon reached Berlin. The shaped charge could penetrate 80 millimeters of steel at a distance of 100 meters. Still, some officers refused to believe it. The Tiger tank, the pride of German engineering, had armor nearly that thick. Its designers boasted that no Allied weapon under 75 millimeters could harm it. So the scientists decided to prove the point. A live Tiger was rolled onto the testing field. The captured bazooka was fitted with a fresh rocket, and one of the researchers, in an act of quiet courage, took aim. The weapon fired with a soft hiss. A streak of smoke. The warhead struck and punched through the Tiger's side armor like a molten needle through wax. The explosion inside wasn't catastrophic, but the message was undeniable. Armor alone was no longer enough. Within weeks, development orders were issued. 2 weapons would emerge from the study. The Offenrohr, literally stovepipe, officially known as the Panzerschreck, and the smaller, disposable Panzerfaust. Both borrowed heavily from the bazooka's core principles, though improved in range and warhead size. Hitler himself took interest in the reports. He demanded accelerated testing and mass production. By early 1944, these new weapons were appearing on both the Eastern and Western fronts, an ironic twist born from captured American ingenuity. At Kummersdorf, the memory of that first test lingered. The laughter that had greeted the strange American toy became a cautionary tale among engineers. It reminded them that the enemy's greatest advantage wasn't always in tanks, aircraft, or numbers, but in ideas that seemed too simple to fear. And it set the stage for one of the most unexpected technological exchanges of the entire war. A moment when arrogance met innovation and innovation quietly won. The German military prided itself on engineering precision. Every machine, from the Messerschmitt fighter to the Panzer tank, reflected a philosophy of craftsmanship and complex mechanisms built to perfection. Efficiency meant mastery, and mastery meant control. The bazooka defied all of that. When the engineers at Kummersdorf laid the weapon out for analysis, they couldn't understand at first how something so crude could be so effective. Its rocket motor was basically a simple solid fuel stick burning inside a steel tube. The electrical firing circuit used ordinary batteries, the same type used in field radios. The launch tube itself wasn't even reinforced. To the German eye, it looked disposable and almost careless. But when they tested it, The results spoke louder than design. Of molten metal traveling at over 7,000 meters per second. Instead of shattering armor through impact, it burned through it a precise self-forging spear of heat and pressure. This was not brute strength. It was science elegantly weaponized. Dr. Hubert Chardin, one of Germany's leading explosives experts, documented the phenomenon with fascination. He noted that the Americans had not invented the shaped charge, but they had perfected its application. The German army had experimented with similar technology before the war, mounting shaped charges on large anti-tank grenades and magnetic mines. But those were heavy, awkward, and required suicidal bravery to use. The bazooka changed that equation completely. It gave a single infantryman the same destructive potential once reserved for artillery. For the first time, a soldier in a foxhole could threaten a tank not by luck or numbers, but by science. The Germans admired that, and they feared it. Inside Kummersdorf's workshops, scientists began to replicate the weapon's core systems. They disassembled the rocket motor, testing different propellant compositions and tube diameters. They experimented with electric firing circuits, improving ignition reliability. They examined the stabilizing fins, noting how the Americans had achieved consistent accuracy with minimal materials. What struck them most wasn't the weapon's power. It was its philosophy. The bazooka was the embodiment of American pragmatism, a weapon designed to be built fast, used easily, and replaced without regret. German design culture, by contrast, sought perfection, precision machining, tight tolerances, complexity for reliability. But by 1943, Germany could no longer afford luxury in design. Factories were bombed daily. Resources were dwindling. Skilled labor was scarce. So when the scientists at Kummersdorf completed their reports, they included a radical recommendation. Germany must embrace simplicity. The first prototypes inspired by the bazooka were dubbed Ofenrohr, literally stovepipe. The weapon would soon become infamous under its official name, Panzerschreck Tank Terror. The Panzerschreck enlarged the bazooka's caliber from 60 mm to 88 mm, allowing for a much larger warhead. It was, in essence, the same weapon but bigger, deadlier, and more intimidating. Engineers also added a blast shield to protect the operator from backblast, a design flaw noticed in American models. When the first German-made rounds were fired, they penetrated more than 150 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy even the heaviest Allied tanks. From skepticism to admiration, the transformation was complete. The toy had become the template for Germany's next great infantry weapon. By early 1944, production of the Panzerschreck and the smaller, disposable Panzerfaust began in earnest. German troops on both fronts would soon wield these weapons with devastating effect. And in that turning point lay a strange irony. The engineers who had once laughed at the bazooka's simplicity had, without realizing it, embraced the very thing they had mocked. In their pursuit of perfection, they had been humbled by efficiency. And as the war entered its final desperate phase, it was no longer the grand machines of German industry that defined combat, but the small, portable, terrifying tools born from the lessons of Kummersdorf. When the German High Command received the Kummersdorf test reports in late 1943, skepticism lingered. To men raised on the might of tanks and artillery, the idea that a single infantryman could destroy a heavily armored Tiger seemed absurd. But the proof was undeniable. Photographs of the test, the small entry hole, the blistered metal, the charred interior told a story that no officer could ignore. For decades, the battlefield hierarchy had been simple. Armor dominated infantry. Now, with a tube of steel and a handful of rockets, that order was reversed. By early 1944, as Allied and Soviet armor pressed in from both fronts, the need for portable anti-tank weapons became desperate. Production orders for Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck surged overnight. The Panzerfaust, designed as a disposable single-shot launcher, was compact and cheap, its simple firing mechanism so easy that even a hastily trained conscript could use it effectively. The Panzerschreck, larger and more powerful, required more care but offered range and armor-piercing superiority. Together, they transformed German infantry tactics. On the Eastern Front, soldiers used them in ambushes, lying hidden among ruins or snowdrifts, waiting for Soviet T-34s to close within 30 meters before firing. In Normandy, they stalked Shermans from hedgerows, firing from cellars and behind stone walls. For the first time since 1939, German foot soldiers could look at an approaching tank and not feel helpless. It was a psychological revolution as much as a tactical one. At Kummersdorf, the initial laughter that had echoed across the test field became a lesson whispered among engineers and officers. Never underestimate simplicity. The bazooka's success carried an uncomfortable truth that American ingenuity often lay not in sophistication, but in practicality. Many German scientists had been trained in a culture of technological elitism, the belief that superior machines guaranteed victory. But by 1944, the air war had already proven otherwise. The Allies, with their mass-produced aircraft and relentless logistics, were winning through quantity and efficiency. Now the bazooka added insult to injury to a weapon so unsophisticated that it mocked German craftsmanship, yet outperformed their early anti-tank rifles and grenades. Reports from field units reinforced the point. Soldiers admired the Panzerfaust's ease of use. Even Volkssturm militia, some as young as 16, could learn to operate it in minutes. It required no complex maintenance, no precious fuel, and no factory precision. The German officer corps, once proud of its engineering superiority, now watched as their war effort depended on what was essentially a metal tube with a rocket. And still it worked. By the final year of the war, Germany's industrial system was collapsing. Bombings had crippled major factories. Skilled workers were either drafted or dead. Raw materials were scarce. The bazooka-inspired weapons arrived just in time to fill the gap. The Panzerfaust's production required minimal resources. No complex optics, no machining beyond crude steel shaping. It could be built in workshops and assembled by unskilled labor. By late 1944, over 6 million Panzerfausts had been produced, one of the most mass-manufactured weapons of the entire war. It was a triumph of necessity over tradition. The irony wasn't lost on the engineers who had once mocked the American original. In internal memoranda, one scientist wrote, "We laughed at the tube. Now the tube is what keeps us in the fight." The bazooka, born of American innovation and refined by German imitation, became a symbol of wartime evolution, the cycle of adaptation that defines survival in total war. It wasn't the most elegant weapon. It wasn't even the most powerful. But it was timely, and in war, timing often matters more than perfection. At Kummersdorf, the laughter had turned to respect. And soon, on the front lines from Warsaw to the Ardennes, that respect would echo in fire and smoke as tanks burned and soldiers realized that even the mightiest armor could be undone by the smallest spark of human ingenuity. Winter, 1944. The forests outside Aachen were quiet except for the groaning of tank engines echoing through the fog. Snow muffled the sounds of movement boots sinking, branches cracking but not the deep, metallic growl of approaching Shermans. Inside a ruined farmhouse, a handful of young German infantrymen crouched by the window. They had one weapon between them, a Panzerfaust 60. The youngest of them, barely 19, held it uncertainly, his hands trembling. Just 6 months earlier, he had been in training near Berlin where an officer had told them proudly, "This came from an American toy. But in your hands it kills tanks." The boy hadn't believed it then. Now the tank was really close enough for him to smell the diesel fumes. The first strike. When the Sherman crested the ridge, its turret scanning left and right, the Germans froze. They had learned by bitter experience that firing too soon was suicide. The range had to be terrifyingly close. The boy steadied his breath, aimed the simple sight, and pressed the trigger. A burst of smoke, a hiss, the rocket streaked forward. Then a hollow explosion. The Sherman stopped, its hull smoking, crew scrambling from the hatch in panic. Cheers erupted inside the farmhouse. For the first time in months, the German soldiers felt something other than exhaustion and defeat. One whispered, half in disbelief, "The Americans built this? They built their own death." The irony of fire across the Western Front this moment was repeating. In the Ardennes, in Holland, in the ruins of Warsaw, small German squads lay in wait with their Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. Each hit was a reminder of how a captured bazooka, once mocked at Kummersdorf, had now become the backbone of Germany's last line of defense. But the irony cuts both ways. The Americans, too, had improved their bazookas' thicker tubes, better rockets, and more reliable ignition. By 1945, Both sides were facing reflections of their own ingenuity. Tank commanders learned to fear every shadow, every farmhouse, every snowdrift because behind it might be a soldier with a rocket tube. War had become personal again. The emotional turning point. A letter recovered after the war. A German lieutenant described the feeling vividly. "We do not fight with divisions anymore, only with moments. A few men, a few seconds, and a single tube that is all that decides life or death." The irony is bitter. The weapon we once called foolish now gives us courage, but it is courage born of desperation. That desperation could be felt everywhere. In the final months of the war, Germany's mighty panzers were few, its skies dominated by Allied bombers, its cities reduced to ash. Yet on the ground, small teams armed with Panzerfaust delayed entire armored columns. The weapon was never enough to win the war, but it changed how the war felt. It gave the illusion of parity. It turned scattered defenders into hunters, even if only for a moment. From laughter to legacy by April 1945. The streets of Berlin echoed with the same sound first heard at Kummersdorf 2 years earlier. The hollow hiss of a rocket and the thunder of impact. Volkssturm militias, old men and boys, carried Panzerfausts on their backs like firewood. They fired from windows, sewers, and rubble piles as Soviet tanks rolled through the city. The laughter of 1943 had long vanished. In its place was a grim understanding. The simple tube, once dismissed, now indispensable, had outlived the Reich itself. When the war ended, Allied investigators found stockpiles of Panzerfausts stacked in warehouses, their crude frames rusting, their paint chipped. They were symbols of both ingenuity and futility, yet too late. American engineers examined them closely, acknowledging their evolution from the humble bazooka. One report summarized it bluntly. They mocked it, then mastered it. But by the time they did, the war had already passed them by. As the guns fell silent across Europe, the story of the bazooka's transformation from American experiment to German redemption became a parable whispered among soldiers and historians alike. That in war, arrogance is the first casualty, and adaptation is the last victory. The Germans had laughed at a toy, but in the end, that toy became the echo that followed them into defeat. By the spring of 1945, the balance of power on the battlefield had shifted in ways no general had foreseen. For nearly 6 years, tanks had ruled the earth steel giants that crushed fortifications, breached cities, and scattered infantry like dust. But now a single soldier with a lightweight tube could stop them cold. It was a reversal of everything the Blitzkrieg had stood for. The same doctrine that once made Germany invincible: speed, armor, and shock was now vulnerable to a $10 weapon, inspired by the very enemy they once underestimated. The battlefield had come full circle. Reports from the Eastern Front told the same story as those from the West. Soviet T-34s and American Shermans were burning at close range, their crews bewildered. The enemy infantry, once helpless before armored spearheads, had learned to strike back with handheld fire. The Germans, who had once relied on their Tiger and Panther tanks for supremacy, were now reduced to small anti-tank ambush teams hidden in ditches, cellars, and forests. In these moments, the mythology of the tank that was the unstoppable war god of the 20th century began to fracture. A battlefield observer later wrote, "The age of giants ended not with thunder, but with a hiss. That hiss was the sound of the Panzerfaust. It didn't just pierce armor, it pierced the illusion of invulnerability itself. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the Panzerfaust wasn't its destructive power. It was how it felt in the hands of those who used it. For young soldiers, many barely trained, it offered a strange kind of hope. You didn't need a tank to fight a tank anymore. You didn't need air cover, artillery, or fuel. You needed one shot, one nerve, and one heartbeat's courage. It democratized destruction. This simple concept would redefine infantry warfare for generations, from the RPGs of the Cold War to the modern Javelin and NLA systems. It began here, in the ruined streets of Europe, where an idea captured in mockery became a revolution born in desperation. The irony was profound. The Germans, famed for over-engineering, had discovered that sometimes less was more. When Allied technical teams examined the captured Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks in 1945, their reports were unemotional, but their tone betrayed respect. They noted the simplicity of the trigger, the shape of the warhead, and the ease of production, all lessons carried directly into post-war designs. Within months, the U.S. Army was already developing new models inspired by what the Germans had done to their original concept. The Cold War's entire anti-tank doctrine, portable, disposable, and deadly, was born from this ironic exchange between enemies. The bazooka had started as an American curiosity, improved by German necessity and perfected by global imitation. It was, in a sense, the first truly international weapon of the modern age. But beyond the weapons, something deeper changed in the psychology of war. The Panzerfaust taught commanders a brutal truth. No machine could dominate forever. Every innovation, no matter how advanced, carried within it the seed of its own countermeasure. Tanks led to rockets. Rockets led to counter-rockets. Every weapon invited its opposite, and behind each invention stood the same human story of arrogance, adaptation, and survival. The laughter of those scientists at Kummersdorf in 1943 wasn't evil or foolish. It was human. They saw a strange weapon and thought they were above it. They didn't realize that in war, even the smallest innovation, even a tube that looked like a toy, could redraw the boundaries of power. As 1945 faded into the ashes of peace, those same scientists were interrogated by Allied teams. They were asked about the Panzerfaust's development, about the captured bazooka, and about what they had learned. One of them reportedly said quietly, "We learned too late that the enemy's ideas were not to be mocked, but to be understood." It was the final echo of a war driven by technology, and a fitting prelude to the world that would follow, where innovation itself became the battlefield. The story of that laughter, that test and that fire didn't end with Germany's defeat. It continued in every nation that picked up the idea, refined it, and prepared for the next war. Because once a weapon like that exists, it never really disappears. It only changes hands, and that understanding, that uneasy balance between invention and destruction, leads us into what comes next. May 1945. Germany had fallen. The Reich that once stretched across Europe now lay in silence, its cities hollowed, its factories still, its armies broken. But among the debris of defeat, Allied engineers and intelligence teams began their quiet work. They weren't searching for glory or vengeance. They were searching for knowledge. In barns, tunnels, and research centers scattered across Germany, they uncovered an astonishing array of prototypes, test weapons, and reports. Jet engines, rocket aircraft, guided bombs, and alongside them, crude steel tubes marked Panzerfaust. To the untrained eye, they seemed almost trivial compared to the high-tech jets and rockets of Peenemünde. But to the soldiers who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes, those tubes represented something far more personal, the weapon that had turned city ruins into death traps. The irony was not lost on the American investigators. 2 years earlier, the Germans had laughed at the bazooka. Now, Allied technicians were studying the Panzerfaust with the same mix of disbelief and respect. In an underground vault near Magdeburg, British and American ordnance experts found detailed test results, armor penetration data, production diagrams, and photographs from Kummersdorf. The documents showed how the Germans had improved on the original bazooka concept by enlarging the warhead and simplifying the launch tube. They had removed the complex reload system and turned it into a single-use disposable weapon, cheap, fast, and effective. A U.S. report dated June 1945 summarized the finding bluntly. The German Panzerfaust represents the most efficient anti-tank weapon in its class. Its simplicity of manufacture and use must be regarded as exemplary. It was a quiet admission that the technological race had come full circle. The Americans had started it. The Germans had perfected it. In the months following Germany's surrender, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department began experiments with several German designs. They invited captured engineers under supervision to explain the principles behind their innovations. From these studies came the seeds of post-war rocket infantry doctrine: lighter, more accurate, and more lethal portable launchers. By 1948, early prototypes of the super bazooka were already entering service with longer range, greater armor penetration, and a shaped charge inspired directly by German refinements. The British developed their own equivalent, the Piat, evolved into next-generation recoilless weapons. The Soviets, too, took careful notes. Within a few years, they would unveil the RPG-2, unmistakably a descendant of the Panzerfaust's philosophy. The weapon that once embarrassed German scientists at a winter test site had now reshaped military strategy across the world. Every nation understood the same truth. No tank, no matter how mighty, could rule the battlefield unchallenged again. The human echo. For the men who had fought in the ruins of Berlin, Warsaw, or Cologne, the Panzerfaust had been more than a weapon. It was a symbol of desperation. It had turned teenagers and old men into tank killers. Many remembered it with bitterness, others with grim pride. Allied soldiers, too, carried their memories. Tank crews recalled the terror of driving through narrow European streets, never knowing which corner hit a man with a single-shot rocket. In interviews years later, many admitted that they felt a reluctant respect for the weapon and for the ingenuity of those who wielded it. The weapon had made every soldier, no matter how young or untrained, potentially deadly. It was warfare stripped to its essence: man versus machine, courage versus steel. The shift in military thinking. When the smoke cleared from Europe, the generals of the new post-war world faced a haunting question. If a $10 weapon could destroy a $100,000 tank, what would that mean for the next war? It forced them to rethink the hierarchy of firepower. No longer could military planners rely solely on heavy armor to dominate the battlefield. They began to focus on combined arms tactics: infantry, artillery, and air support woven together to prevent the kind of asymmetric vulnerability the Panzerfaust had exposed. It was the beginning of modern tactical warfare. The age of the lone tank, thundering across open fields, was over. In its place came something colder, more methodical, a dance of soldiers and machines, each dependent on the other for survival. In that sense, the bazooka and its German offspring did more than change weapons. They changed the language of war itself. And yet the lessons weren't just technical or strategic. They were deeply human, born from curiosity, arrogance, fear, and survival. Those scientists at Kummersdorf hadn't meant to create a revolution. They had only wanted to understand a foreign weapon, to test it, to measure it. But in doing so, they helped accelerate a shift that would define the rest of the 20th century. That shift didn't stop in 1945. The world was dividing again. New powers rising, old alliances fading, and another kind of war taking shape in the shadows. And in that new conflict, the humble anti-tank rocket would find a permanent place, not as a relic, but as a warning. In the years that followed the German surrender, the world began to rebuild, but the silence of peace was already trembling beneath the new storm of the Cold War. Every superpower wanted to know the same thing. What had the other side learned from the war? From the laboratories of Los Alamos to the missile ranges of Kapustin Yar, the hunt for knowledge replaced the hunt for victory. And among the thousands of designs copied, adapted, and refined, one small idea stood out: the infantry anti-tank rocket. It was strange, almost poetic, that something once dismissed as a toy would become a cornerstone of global military doctrine. The bazooka and the Panzerfaust were never just relics of 1943. They were templates, adaptable, teachable, and scalable. In the divided Germany of the late 1940s, Soviet engineers in the East and American scientists in the West were both dissecting the same idea under different flags. The East German Volkspolizei trained with crude RPG-2s modeled directly on the Panzerfaust. Across the border, U.S. occupation troops demonstrated the super bazooka to NATO allies: longer range, heavier punch, same principle. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Two sides of a fractured world, arming themselves with the offspring of the same wartime revelation. A German weapon built from an American idea now stood between East and West, a product of both and a warning to both. For post-war Germany, the Panzerfaust carried a heavy duality. It was celebrated by some as a technical triumph, proof of German ingenuity, even in defeat. But for others, it symbolized the tragedy of desperate boys and old men sent against tanks in the final days of a lost war. In films and memoirs of the 1950s, the weapon appeared in brief, haunting flashes, not as a banner of victory, but as a grim reminder of the collapse that forced scientists to laugh at something they didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, in the United States, the bazooka became a symbol of American innovation and adaptability. It appeared in training films, war comics, and even toy catalogs, stripped of its battlefield horror and reimagined as a mark of ingenuity. But behind the patriotic gloss, the engineers knew the truth. The weapon's perfection had been achieved only after the enemy had improved it. War, once again, had proven that progress has no nationality, only urgency. By the 1950s, the basic shape of the bazooka and Panzerfaust could be seen everywhere in Korea, in Indochina, in the training camps of newly independent nations. The concept had escaped its creators and gone global. On frozen Korean hillsides, American soldiers fired bazookas against waves of Chinese tanks, often finding that the improved Soviet armor demanded new warheads. In response, engineers refined the shape charge, widened the blast cone, and added optical sights. In a cruel symmetry, Soviet advisors later handed similar weapons born from the Panzerfaust line to their own allied forces around the world. Every side now used a descendant of that laughable toy from 1943. Each one carried the same hiss, the same spark, the same ghost of that winter test at Kummersdorf. By the end of the 20th century, the world had seen tanks burn in every climate, jungles, deserts, and cities. No longer were they symbols of unstoppable power. They were reminders of balance, that every weapon, no matter how advanced, had its countermeasure waiting somewhere in a forgotten field or a laboratory sketchbook. This understanding reshaped military philosophy forever. Armies learned that dominance was never permanent, that innovation and humility had to coexist. And somewhere within that lesson lived the memory of the German scientists who once laughed at the bazooka, only to watch it tear through their strongest creation. It wasn't just a story about a weapon. It was a story about perspective, the arrogance of certainty, the cost of underestimation, and the irony of discovery. Today, in museums across Europe and America, the bazooka and the Panzerfaust often rest side by side. Visitors walk past them quickly, unaware of the strange historical loop that binds them. One began as innovation, the other as imitation. Together, they formed the bridge between the industrial wars of the past and the technological conflicts of the future. On display, they look like harmless metal tubes, rusted fins, cracked grips. But within their silence lies the echo of that moment in 1943, when laughter turned to shock, and an empire realized that no armor was eternal. That echo still lingers in every weapon built since, in every engineer who studies the enemy's ideas not with contempt, but with respect. The war had ended, but its lessons had only just begun. And through those lessons, humanity discovered not just new ways to destroy, but new reasons to understand. War often begins with certainty, the belief that one side knows more, builds better, fights harder. But history has a way of humbling those certainties. At Kummersdorf in 1943, a handful of German scientists watched their confidence melt into disbelief. They saw a thin American tube, mocked it, tested it, and learned in one blinding instant that brilliance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. The bazooka and the Panzerfaust were not just weapons. They were mirrors reflecting the arrogance and the curiosity that define human invention. Each nation borrowed, learned, improved, and, in the process, exposed the illusion that progress belongs to one flag alone. When that rocket pierced the armor of the Tiger tank, it also pierced the heart of technological pride. It showed that every empire, no matter how advanced, stands only until the next idea challenges it. For the soldiers on the ground, those ideas were not theories, they were survival. A single man could now stand against a machine. And in that balance between weakness and innovation, the modern battlefield was born. Long after the smoke of World War II faded, the lessons of that frozen German test field endured. They lived on in every weapon that followed, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East. Each hiss of a rocket carried the same warning from the past. Never underestimate simplicity. Today, when historians speak of the Tiger tank, they recall its armor, its power, its myth. But somewhere beneath that legend lies a smaller story of men who laughed, then fell silent, realizing that the future of warfare would belong not to the biggest machine but to the sharpest mind. In the end, the sound that changed history wasn't the roar of an engine or the blast of a cannon. It was the hiss of a small rocket slicing through winter air, and the silence that followed, when the world of war learned to listen.